Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Animal agriculture is vital to Nebraska. Livestock production not only contributes to our food supply, but also helps our rural communities. Livestock provides revenue for schools, creates jobs, supports Main Street, and enhances the future for farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Board's Animal Agriculture Initiative works to encourage growth of responsible livestock enterprises to benefit agriculture and Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. This week, Wade Johannes gives us his thoughts on corn and soybean markets. David Kohl discusses global agriculture. Mark Caspers from the Nebraska Soybean Board talks about the prominence of soybean meal in the aquaculture diet. And Dave Aiken outlines the challenges in livestock development. Wade Johannes from Central Valley Ag is our marketing analyst this week. The fiscal cliff remained in play this week, while the markets for corn, soybeans, and wheat look ahead to key January reports that could add volatility to their prices. We talked with Wade on Wednesday morning about how those commodities could exit 2012 and enter 2013. As we look at corn and soybean markets, I found an interesting thing in your weekly recap last week. You said, talking about soybeans, simply they have a math problem. Explain that.
Well, basically, when you look at where the crush numbers are at and where the export numbers are at, we're way ahead of the USDA's projections. Right now, the crush is running 10% ahead, and the USDA is calling for an 8% decrease year over year. And so, yes, that can slow down, but it has to slow down dramatically on the crush, and obviously exports are running way ahead as well.
Soybeans got hammered a bit on Tuesday. Was that because of China? In part, at least?
Yeah, the USDA announced that China canceled 300,000 tons of soybean cargoes, and then an unknown buyer, which is usually China as well, canceled another 120,000. So the market reacted. It was somewhat of a surprise at this time because they just bought some. I think it was just last week, and then the following week they go and cancel some. But that's the way China plays the game.
Right. You look towards South America. What are you seeing there as far as planting progress, weather, what you expect to see come out of that region after the first of the year?
Well, generally speaking, Brazil is off to a great start. I saw one estimate that said that 40% of Brazil is perfect in that one analyst's opinion. So Brazil is probably looking at a crop that could be better than the current USDA estimate. Argentina, just the opposite, extremely wet in some areas. Some areas won't be planted at all. And so that estimate will probably come down a little bit.
Some analysts are saying you could see something like 17 when we come into the spring. How are you weighing that? I know we talked about this last week, but as we get closer and as we start to see the progress there, what do you recommend to producers?
Well, you got to remember that there's an inverse in the futures market, and that's telling you that the market wants the soybeans now, not later. Once we get into the spring, we have to contend with the fact that South America's crop is going to be hitting the market. So I'm recommending to producers, let's look at that 50% retracement level. Let's make a sale maybe around that 1550 area for some old crop beans. Probably leave some in case we do get back to those $17 levels, but I don't think it's worth hanging on to everything just in case that happens.
With either corn or beans, what level makes you sweat when you talk about demand destruction? Because some people believe there's not enough rationing yet, and once we get into spring, both on corn and beans, there will need to be more done. What level makes you uncomfortable?
Well, I think on the corn side, I think we are seeing enough demand destruction. I guess the January quarterly stocks report will give us a lot better feel for what the first quarter's feed demand was. Until that, we probably won't know where we're at. That feed number is going to be a huge hinge, higher or lower, in terms of overall demand. On the soybean side, I think the USDA is putting in a carryout, and they're working backwards from there and saying, okay, this is what projections are. We've kind of seen that in the last few years in terms of corn. They'll put a carryout in, then work backwards and figure out what the yield ends up being.
What do you think the expectation is for the January report, specifically on corn? That's where a lot of eyes are going to look when you look at stocks.
It's going to be big. It always is. I mean, I think it's 3 of the last 4 years in corn. It's been a limit move, higher or lower,
right,
not always higher. And so there's just huge implications in that report between the quarterly stocks and the supply and demand final numbers. There's just a lot of information coming out on that day.
You look towards ethanol, there's just not much good news at this point, but crude oil-wise in the United States, for the United States as a whole, good news. For ethanol, what does it mean?
Well, it's interesting. Here in the last week, I came across an article talking about how North Dakota is now the #2 oil-producing state in the country behind Texas. They surpassed Alaska, of all places. And it's all due to the Bakken shale oil reserves. And that's something that 4 years ago we weren't even talking about. And now there's projections that we could possibly be oil independent by 2020. Well, when you think back into the early 2000s, Jeff, and why did we subsidize ethanol as the way we did? It was because of the energy crisis and because we had to produce enough energy to keep up with demand. Well, when you start taking away some of that demand and start talking about energy balance, there's going to be a lot less enthusiasm to support the ethanol industry long term.
One thing you said when you came in this morning is the weather, or at least the conditions, are local, and once you get east of maybe Des Moines, somewhere in Iowa, it starts to turn around. How so?
Well, when you look at one of the things we go through in our winter meetings is talking about, okay, what the drought looked like this summer, and it was all over the entire Corn Belt. Now, when you look at the drought, basically, like you said, east of Des Moines, it looks a lot better. The state of Indiana caught 2 hurricanes since this summer. So they're going into the spring in a lot better condition than we are here locally.
Our show next week won't feature a specific market analyst. We'll instead show you the major issues from this year in clips from each of our 51 shows. For markets, that includes the progression of a drought across the country, struggles for ethanol, and high-priced feed for the livestock industry. The 2012 Census of Agriculture is currently underway. 3 million surveys were sent out December 14th. We recently visited with Greg Ibaugh, the director of the Nebraska Department of Agriculture, about the importance of filling out surveys completely and accurately.
Well, you know, being a farmer myself, I sometimes look at the form and think, oh my goodness, you know, why do I want to spend this much time doing that? But in my job as director of ag and working with USDA and Congress and other agencies in the federal government, it's amazing how many times decision makers are looking at that data, and they'll look at it, you know, from a county basis clear up to a state and national basis, and they decide where funds flow based on, you know, where agriculture exists and what kind of agriculture that is. So to know that we have, you know, how many cows we have, or how many acres of crops we have, or how many specialty crop producers we have, becomes important to how that money flows into Nebraska.
Information for the U.S. Census of Agriculture is compiled every 5 years. This year, surveys can be completed through the mail or online and are due February 4th. At last Friday's Soybean Day Machinery Expo in Wahoo, we spoke with David Kohl, a professor emeritus of Ag Econ at Virginia Tech and president of AgriVisions LLC. While agriculture has its own challenges domestically, such as the overall uncertainty in Washington, it also faces major issues internationally. Take Europe, for example. David mentioned Friday that 12 of 17 Euro nations are currently in a recession. We discussed those global issues, as well as China's importance to the U.S. soybean industry, the current commodity supercycle, and long-term impacts of fiscal cliff discussions.
It's interesting, the fiscal cliff, whether it happens or it doesn't, say we go over the cliff, potentially we could take 2.6 to 3.6 off the U.S. economy. And it could potentially put us back into a recession, because what's happening is many business people and the consumers are basically digging in because they're uncertain about the rules out of Washington, D.C. The other aspect of the fiscal cliff is whether we go over it or we don't. I tell agricultural producers you can plan on paying 10 to 12% more in income tax, regardless of whether we go over the cliff. So what's happening is it's changing the psychology, and you know, our moms and dads and grandmothers and grandfathers had to manage volatility. We have to manage volatility at the extreme. And so what it does to agriculture producers, it locks them up. And so what I tell them is do scenario planning, and do 5 or 10 different scenarios on revenues and costs and plow through it.
Does it add any confusion to the export market if the strength of the dollar throws one way or the other?
Absolutely. Matter of fact, if you look at this great super cycle that we're in, one of the contributing factors was the low value of the dollar. And of course, Federal Reserves had a big impact on that. And it's real interesting. A low value of the dollar encourages agricultural exports. But you know what the other element? Many other countries are watching the United States, and they're actually losing a little bit of confidence in us. And that doesn't bode very, very well, particularly when they finance a lot of our debt.
They lose confidence because we can't get anything done?
Absolutely. Matter of fact, one of the things that you're seeing is politics is starting to trump sound economic decisions. And so we're kind of analogous to a bickering family. You really don't want to do business with them.
You mentioned the super cycle. Is it a concern with what we're paying for land prices that this thing could go somewhere that we don't want it to go?
Well, it's real interesting. I've been in many sites in Nebraska here this week, and if you would really think about farm land values, they're hotter than a pepper sprout, if we go back to the old Johnny Cash song. But it's all been because of this super cycle. This super cycle, there's been 4 in the past 100 years. This super cycle has lasted 2.5 times longer. And so what it's happened is it's been capitalized, the profits have been capitalized right into these land values. But I think I'm asked, are we in an asset bubble? I think we are in an asset bubble, not a credit bubble, but an asset bubble. And if you really look at from 2007 to the current date, you look at this land value spiking, like here in Nebraska, 34%. It's not sustainable. And so one of the things is we have all the perfect elements that are being capitalized in these land values, and so we're 10 years. Somewhere between year 10 and year 15 we'll probably dismount off this super cycle. So to all the producers that are here today, and I've talked to, you better have your dismount strategy.
The one thing I'm hearing from a lot of people, or from some people I guess, is that there's more of an interest to coming back to the farm now, because when you look at corn and grain, if you're a grain farmer, you can make a decent amount of money. But is that a concern when you talk about possibly the super cycle ending in 10 years?
Well, it's really interesting you bring that up. If a producer's under 40 years of age, they were 10 years of age during the last correction. If they're under 30, they've never experienced bad times in agriculture. So yes, it is a concern. And what's going to be real interesting is to see how the younger generation takes a punch. It's kind of like a football team, you go through a little bit of adversity, they'll either start bickering and break up, or they will get stronger. I think one of the things is there will be a call to our younger producers that have come back or are interested in coming back if the super cycle corrects. But it is kind of great to see the young people coming back, because it's adding a whole new set of energy. So it's a lot of fun for me to see all the youth coming back in.
I'll end globally. If you look at a country like China, who's done so much to buy agricultural products, is that something that you think continues and might still give strength to U.S., especially when it comes to goods like soybeans?
It's real interesting when you look at China. They've been growing at a 10.8% growth rate, GDP growth rate, for the past 30 years. That's unprecedented in world economic history. But their growth rate is starting to slow down. China's coming in with its new leader into a new era where they're trying to keep social harmony. And so one of the things is China is the fulcrum of all the emerging nations, which are almost equal to the size of the U.S. economy and have represented 50% of the world growth. China is a key to keep our eye on, as well as interest rates and the value of the dollar.
We'll have more from the Soybean Day and Machinery Expo in 2 weeks with Dave Gaylor from the North Central Risk Management Education Center. The aquaculture industry uses over 3.8 million metric tons of U.S. soybean meal. For a point of reference, the global cattle industry uses just less than 3.8 million metric tons. At a recent Nebraska Soybean Board meeting, we spoke with District 5 Director Mark Caspers about why aquaculture is an important sector to the soybean industry.
Well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, we're going to need a viable protein source to feed the millions of people that are growing population in Asia, and this aquaculture seems to be a real good fit. It's a sustainable type of resource, seems to be renewable. The problem with the aquaculture right now is the ocean is running out of meal fish to feed the aquaculture in. So we're using our soybean meal to feed these fish, and we're working with Tom Clemente here at Nebraska, designing some new type of soybeans that are going to work better for that protein source, and the fish are going to be able to metabolize that into a omega-3 fatty acid, hopefully, if everything is successful on this.
Are the people in the aquaculture industry pleased with soybean meal because of how fast it allows them to grow? Is that accurate?
Yeah, the growth has been proven to be on an equal basis with the fish meal, but the reason they're very pleased about it is the cost of the soybean meal is substantially less, because the cost of the fish meal has been driven up high in recent years as the supply declines on that.
And I would imagine that the aquaculture market, is that something that can just continue to grow?
Oh, I see tremendous growth in it. In fact, they've charted it out over the next 15 to 20 years. There's going to be a lot of growth in the aquaculture because, like I said, we've got a exponentially growing population in Asia that's going to need a viable protein source to feed them.
Let's talk about the other side of the bean then. That's the soybean oil. One of the markets that's really come into play here is bioheat. Why does that make such a good fit for soybean oil?
You know, I think that's really a win-win situation for all the citizens of the United States, because it's a renewable resource right here at home. We're able to grow the soybean, crush it, send the meal over to Asia for feed their fish over there, and then we can maintain the oil right here, and we can burn it as a home heating oil. Predominantly that's done in the Northeast area, but that's environmentally safe. It's a renewable resource. We can lessen our dependence on this foreign oil. We can keep it all right here at home. A lot of people in the Northeast tend to be a little bit more environmentally conscious, so they're willing to pay just a little bit more if they have to for their home heating oil, to know that it's a renewable resource and it is environmentally friendly. I just think that's a real win-win and a great future there.
How successful, it kind of plays into another one, and that's biodiesel. How successful has biodiesel been overall?
Biodiesel is probably one of the major success stories of the soybean checkoff. It's just brought tremendous returns per dollar invested back to the producers in the entire United States, but especially back to Nebraska. A lot of that oil is originated here in Nebraska from our soybeans growing here, and it's just brought tremendous returns back. It's phenomenal, the returns per dollar invested that the biodiesel program has brought back to Nebraska producers. Something we can be really proud of, because Nebraska was a leader in the biodiesel industry, and I think Nebraska farmers really need to be cognizant and be proud of that fact.
The 2013 crop production clinics will be held at 9 different locations across Nebraska beginning in January. The clinics are designed to provide information to aid crop producers and agribusiness professionals in their overall profitability. UNL Extension weed science educator Lowell Sandell explains a few of this year's topics.
On the weed science side, we'll be talking about resistance, because there's a number of new developments in terms of glyphosate resistant weed species in the state. Our plant pathology and entomology colleagues will be giving an insect and disease update for the state. And then in the second track of the clinics, we'll have crop production information, soil fertility, and irrigation information. And a lot of those topics they're kind of focused on some of the drought conditions and how to manage in some of these dry conditions that we have right now.
The crop production clinics will kick off in Hastings January 8th and will run throughout the month of January. For a complete schedule and for registration information, visit cpc.unl.edu. Certified crop advisors also have an opportunity to earn continuing education credits at these clinics. Looking at livestock development in the state, Dave Aiken says one future concern for continuing growth may be livestock odors. We talked with Dave Wednesday about the past and present issues and why livestock development is a concern in Nebraska.
Well, there's an emerging interest in rural revitalization in Nebraska, trying to see what we can do to give the rural economy a boost. And livestock development is a fairly easy way for us to do that in Nebraska, because we've got all the pieces. So, we could feed a lot more livestock in Nebraska, and that would definitely help our rural economy.
What's the concern then with trying to build more?
Well, mainly it is odor. It's economics is obviously important, and right now we've got high grain prices, and so that makes it tough. But in the long run, people are concerned about having very large livestock facilities close to them and it interfering with their life.
What's the zoning requirements now?
Well,
I'm sure it differs from county to county.
Yes, in Nebraska, we allow county zoning, and we authorize counties to zone agriculture. Not all states do that, but we do in Nebraska. And so many counties in Nebraska, 85 or 86, have zoning requirements that would affect livestock facilities, and many of them have, the bigger the livestock facility, the farther away you have to be from your closest neighbor.
Has the livestock zoning thing been a problem before in this state?
Yes, it's been a huge political issue in the late 80s and early 90s when we saw a major shift from small-scale swine production to the larger confinement units. And when those larger confinement units came in, for a while they ran up against corporate farming requirements in Nebraska. And then when the corporate farming requirements were overruled in federal court, they then ran up against county zoning requirements. And so this has been kind of I've sometimes referred to it as kind of a rural civil war in Nebraska.
There are livestock-friendly counties in Nebraska. You said livestock-friendly before. Is there a correlation here or a difference?
Yes. We have 21 counties that have been approved by the Nebraska Department of Ag as being livestock friendly. That means that they feel that their zoning requirements don't discriminate against new livestock facilities and stuff like that. We also have another 6 counties beyond that don't have any zoning at all. So that's 27 counties. Almost 30% of the counties in Nebraska are livestock friendly in this zoning context.
So we know what the landscape is then for those in the agricultural world. Where do they go from here? What do they do? What can they do?
Well, we've had this discussion in the early 2000s, 2002 and 2003, when there was an attempt to try to basically roll back the county zoning requirements. The people that wanted to do that lost, despite a lot of political support. And I think they were surprised by the concerns, citizen and county concerns regarding the odors, possible groundwater contamination, and so forth. So if we're going to try this again, I think that these issues need to be part of the discussion.
You can find more information on this issue in a recent Cornhusker Economics article on the UNL Ag Econ website. Stan Jensen of York is one of the pioneers of drought tolerance in corn hybrids. You can read about his research achievements in the December Nebraska Farmer. While he's been retired from DuPont Pioneer for several years, Jensen is still widely known for his drought tolerance work near York and elsewhere in the Great Plains. Pioneer officials say Jensen's development of inbreds in the 1950s and 1960s are the great-grandparents of some of the best inbreds Pioneer has today. You can read more about the Deacon of Drought in the December Nebraska Farmer. Much of the state saw precipitation in some form over the past week. Here to forecast any chances for the next few days is UNL Extension state climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. In fact, this will be the last forecast of 2012 with the university shutting down next week. Before we get to the main forecast, let's take a briefly update of what happened over this last 7-day period. Of course, last weekend, we've seen a nice rainmaker across eastern Nebraska. 4/10 to 8/10 of an inch of liquid equivalent moisture was pretty common. There were some pockets of greater than an inch total reported in portions of Seward, Saline, Fairbury, Gage, and Lancaster counties. And then, of course, we've seen another potent system move across the central United States during the midweek period, where we've seen anywhere from 3 to 5 inches of snow across a broad-based portion of the southern half of Nebraska. But within that, we did see anywhere from 8 to upwards of 10 inches of snowfall, essentially from Hastings up toward the valley area. So we really do welcome the moisture. Unfortunately, when we started to look at the soil moisture monitoring networks across the state that's run by the High Plains Regional Climate Center, we didn't notice any response at the 12-inch soil moisture depth. That means that all this moisture we received is still being contained in the top foot of the profile, and we've seen none of it soak down below the 12-inch mark. So we're going to need considerably more of these precipitation events to have an overall impact on our soil moisture profiles as we go into next spring. Is there more in the forecast? Let's take a look at the upper miles and see what we have in store. Well, for today, the system that was responsible for inclement weather is now moving off the eastern United States, and we do have high pressure loft that will keep skies pretty much clear today. very nice conditions considering the amount of snow that we have around on the ground. Draw your attention to the trough in the western United States. That'll be making its way here and possibly giving us some snow as we get close to Christmas. But by tomorrow, what we are going to notice is we start to see that ridge flatten out, and we have one way that's going to move across the Dakotas. It looks like the snow will stay to this area, and then it'll sweep as the trough strengthens across the eastern corn belt. So there is a chance for flurries in northern Nebraska, but for the most part, we should see fairly dry conditions with a little bit cooler conditions working in. Now, as we get into Monday, you see this trough starts to deepen. We get a little bit of a ridging, but there is a considerable amount of cold air that's going to infiltrate behind this. So we are going to see fairly decent conditions on Monday for the most part, with some increasing clouds late in the day across western Nebraska. But overall, we're not expecting much in the way of significant moisture. Now, by the time we get to Tuesday, we'll notice that the models are indicating that trough digs way down into Texas, and we could see some upslope flow component across western Nebraska, best places for accumulating snowfall. And some of that may move through toward the evening and overnight hours across eastern Nebraska. But again, accumulations don't look that significant. By the time we get into Wednesday, trough moves to our east. We get a ridging pattern building, but very cold conditions coming from the northwest, so well below normal temperatures. And that pretty much holds in status quo for Thursday. And by the time we get to Friday, we'll start to see another trough make its way into our region that could give us, once again, another potential snowstorm for the Central Plains. As we look at the main forecast temperatures, we'll notice that the warmest temperatures are for today, and then we see a much significant cooling trend as we go through midweek before we start to warm up slightly toward the week. The 8 to 14-day forecast indicates a cool trend will continue, and in terms of precipitation, it looks like our precipitation will be to the east and west of us.
Thanks, Al. To see our interviews with Wade Johannes, David Kohl, Mark Caspers, or Dave Aiken, you can download the Market Journal mobile app or view them on our web and YouTube pages online. Next week, we'll take a look back at the major stories of this year as we show you clips from each of our 51 shows in 2012. You'll see the progression, or lack thereof, in the 2012 Farm Bill and follow changes in the drought monitor that rocketed commodity prices. We'll also include clips from our reporting from Washington State, China, and numerous locations in Nebraska. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.